Thank you. Thank you very much. Greetings to all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. It's a pleasure for me to be here this morning. I would like to thank the organization of this event, especially Professor Bernardo Buarque and Professor Maria Alice Nogueira for the privilege of the invitation. Thank you very much, Professor Isami Romero and Professor Lamartine da Costa for your excellent presentations. It's so important for us to be able to understand a bit more about the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo, and again, the Games in 2020, 2021, this year, right? I will divide my contribution into three parts. The first part, I will make a short introduction that I would like to share, and that is based upon some questions, right? Remembered by both presentations, right? I will use this introduction to ask my questions. Well, when we talk about urban imaginaries, the image of modern cities seems to immediately come to our minds. In fact, according to the specialized literature, urban imaginaries are everywhere, right? From new visions of cities that are smart, ecological, and resilient, to postcard images of urban vintage and nostalgia. From the latest and most advanced types of architecture to activism for new spatial justice, from urban utopias in film, photography, and literature to enlarged urban realities in location-based games and mobile apps. Well, Christoph Lindner and Miriam Meissner in their 2019 article also point out that urban imaginaries are part of our everyday lives in the city. And this includes tourism, city branding, art, architecture, planning, policy making, and much more. I would also include the Olympic Games, since any edition of the Games can cause huge changes in the host city and in the host country due to this very intimate relationship that seems to exist between the host city, the host country, and the Olympic Games. As we speak of Tokyo 1964 and Tokyo of 2020 and 2021, right, host city of two editions of the Olympic Games, 57 years apart, we can't avoid thinking of two separate realities, right? Two separate contexts. In spite of this time difference, it is important to remember that cities tend to be seen as complex and sophisticated sets of social, spatial, and material characteristics. They are understood in terms of design and infrastructure, and habitation and density, diversity, economic activity, political organization, ecology, and the list goes on, right? As time goes by, urban imaginaries change to adapt to the evolution of humankind, whatever location is considered. We add technology and innovation on top of that, as evolution and transformations come from several perspectives. As we know, Tokyo 1964 had to undergo multiple transitions and shifts in multiple areas, political, economic, social, cultural, etc. Changes have also been taking place in the Olympic movement since the foundation of the IOC in 1894 by Père and Pierre de Coubertin. The IOC was itself an innovation, right? As time went by and into the 20th century, the Olympic movement had to remodel its own structure and adjust its own ecosystem in order to keep up the changes society around the world was going through. In response to the many challenges, for example, the Olympic program came to include women athletes and professional athletes, to increase the number of sports and athletes, to add winter sports and youth games, to rescue Olympic values, and to finally come up with the highest innovation of all, Olympic Agenda 2020, published in 2014, as mentioned by Professor da Costa, with 40 recommendations. The main objective of Olympic Agenda 2020 is to give a clear picture of where the Olympic movement is heading and how the uniqueness of the games can be protected and Olympic values can be strengthened in society. These recommendations include several areas, in particular, sustainability and cost reduction, which are directly associated with urban imaginaries. Along the years, the successful expansion and the prosperous development of the Olympic movement established an essential field of study and research named Olympic Studies, which comprises a very broad area devoted to anything related to the Olympic movement, from philosophy and history to education, law, and place shaping, urban imaginaries. Right? The scope of Olympic studies grew in size and number of scholars, expanded into centers and research groups around the world, which gave rise to the so much knowledge as we are sharing here this morning, right? In the case of Brazil, 5 research groups have been founded in different states, developing projects, conducting studies, and producing knowledge and innovation. On the pathway to further changes based upon and using technology and innovation, 6 recommendations of Olympic Agenda 2020 led the IOC to develop and introduce the new norm in 2018. This document focuses on the organization of the Olympic Games to provide host cities with more flexibility as they design the games to meet long-term development goals. This document deals straight with urban imaginaries. According to the IOC, more than 80 of the 118 ambitious solutions that have been proposed would result in cost efficiencies without compromising the Olympic experience. The plan invites opportunities to, for example, reduce venue sizes, rethink transport options, optimize existing infrastructure, and reuse the field of play for various sports, thus contributing for the city, for the population, and for the games. And just 2 months ago in March, the IOC approved this 3rd document, Olympic Agenda 2020 +5, as the new strategic roadmap of the IOC and the Olympic movement through to achievements of Olympic Agenda 2020 and will guide the work of the IOC and the Olympic movement for the next 5 years. IOC President Thomas Barr explained, the coronavirus crisis has changed our world in fundamental ways. The world will never again be like it was before. Even once we have finally overcome the health crisis, we will face the far-reaching social, financial, economic, and political consequences. As we read this new document, it's possible to identify 5 trends in the 15 recommendations, many of which revisit Olympic Agenda 2020. They are solidarity, digitalization, sustainability, credibility, economic, and financial resilience. They are all associated with urban imaginaries and change, right? The main theme of our event here. Now, of course, these documents did not exist at the time of Tokyo 1964 Olympic Games, but we know that Japan had to reinvent itself, as mentioned by Professor Isami Romero, in order to reach the success of the mega event, which had the participation of 93 nations, more than 1,500 athletes who competed in 163 events of 19 sports. Professor Isami Romero illustrated very well the events that preceded the Tokyo 1964 Olympic Games. We can observe that these games celebrated Japan's progress and reemergence on the world stage. In reality, Japan had been completely transformed in less than 20 years. And what a legacy gave to the Japanese people and to the world, right? How much planning was involved and how much effort for the very qualified team, right, called Dream Team, who worked with Prime Minister Hayato Ikeda. To host such a major event, Tokyo's infrastructure needed to be modernized in time for large numbers of expected tourists. It was time for Japan to showcase to the world enormous energy, effort and expense was devoted to upgrading the city's physical infrastructure, including new buildings, highways, stadiums, hotels, airports, and trains. And of course, a lot of technology had been developed and used. Well, this time, it will not be different, right? To give examples that appear in the specialized literature, 30 venues, including newly constructed, renovated, and temporary facilities, were used in the Tokyo metropolitan area and 4 other municipalities. These games also raised the curtain on Japan's era of rapid economic growth, with the construction of expressways and bullet train. But this urban infrastructure was not the only legacy of the games, right? Japan set forward an effective program of athletic development and achieved major success during the games. Sports clubs sprang up across the country and played a very important role in spreading sports in Japan. As a result, it became possible for a broad section of society, from children to adults and the elderly, to enjoy sport on a regular basis. The 1964 games were also the first ones to be broadcast internationally without the need for tapes to be flown overseas, as it had happened in Rome in 1960, for example. Although the Japanese local committee did not know then what we know now, it's possible to note that Tokyo and Japan did their homework very well, as the games were very successful. Now, taking then these thoughts into consideration, I would like then to address a few questions to both Professor Isami Romero and Professor Lamartine da Costa, which is my second part here in this contribution. Then I would like then to ask the first question to Professor Isami Romero, right? This question goes like this. A key issue of any mega event lays on the fact that its organization is a very complex and sophisticated process, which requires the sequestration of host resources, right? While demanding the involvement of a considerable number of stakeholders. Many studies have criticized the way some of these stakeholders, such as the host community, are managed throughout the project's life cycle. Several authors point out that the host community support plays a key role for a city to win the rights to host a mega event, like the Olympic Games, for example. However, some researchers have supported the fact that while the host community is perceived as a crucial stakeholder at the bidding phase, the claims of this population often become neglected in both the planning and the delivery phases. Having this in mind, my question is then, how do you think, or how would you describe the support received by Ikeda's government in relation to the 1964 games?
Thank you very much, Professor Mirogaya. And now we go straight to the comments of Professor Müller.
Well, thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you very much also to Anna for being very much also an expert in Tokyo and the Tokyo Games, which is something I'm not. So I cannot claim to have any expertise regarding Japan, but I'm happy that many others are here that can compensate for that. I think if I've been invited to be a discussant, then it's perhaps for some other expertise I might bring to the table, which is the urban expertise. I am a geographer, as Bernardo said earlier, and I've studied the Olympic Games for a while. And I think many of you, like myself today, have woken up actually to headlines of the Tokyo 2021 Olympic Games, because when I opened the webpage of the Swiss News Service this morning, I read about the Olympic Games in Tokyo, and about a survey that found that about 60% of people in Japan were now for canceling the Olympic Games and not going ahead. Of course, one of the rules of any serious social science researcher is to mistrust any survey you haven't done yourself, or at least any survey that doesn't provide a long appendix for replication. I looked into it into a little more detail. And of course, there was no appendix for application there. It was a newspaper survey. But apparently, there were 1 or 2 other surveys that were conducted that arrived at similar results. So let's take it for granted that there is a significant opposition actually for going ahead with the games. And let's take it for granted that the corona situation looks very different in the different countries that we live in at the moment. I think for those living in Switzerland, we've become a little more relaxed over the past weeks. And certainly when you look outside, we're here at Lake Geneva, you wouldn't think that any kind of corona is going on by the degree of partying that is happening here. But the situation is very different in Japan, I think. Why am I mentioning this? Because I think it cuts directly to some of the arguments that Isami and Lamartine da Costa have made. It cuts to the argument that Isami started his talk with, because Isami, you looked at the reasons why in Japan the Olympic Games were so much adored and loved. And you said, you know, it's really love. And I found it quite interesting. That's one thing I find increasingly important when studying the Olympic Games, is studying the affective side of those games, the elements that touch us, that excite us, that give us some kind of, you know, that grip us when we are in the stadium. And I think this is a very strong and underexplored strand of research for looking at the Olympic Games. And I think for me, this is part of their staying power, actually. It's not in the cost-benefit calculations, the hard and cold calculations you make, but it's in the way they touch people and people across the board. Now, the thing is, of course, that if all of a sudden you have a majority of people who are against this, you also need to ask yourself, is that still the case? And that would probably be my first question to Isami. Does your diagnosis that you made for the 1964 Games, Japanese love the Olympic Games, they love to party, does that still hold for today? Would you still say the same for today? And I think also it's quite opportune that we're having this discussion now, because I think Tokyo 2020-21 will be remembered as a turning point in the history of the Olympic Games. And I know that it is a bit of a wager perhaps to say that right now, because we can't look into the future. Any of us can't look into the future. But one of my other fields is Soviet studies, post-Soviet studies. I'm an expert of Russia. That's why you find this map here behind me. And the current moment reminds me a little of a moment in the mid-1980s in Soviet studies, when you ask any kind of expert in Soviet studies in the mid-1980s about the future of the Soviet Union, and many would say, well, now economically they're not doing so well, and there are some crises, but there's also a reform program by Gorbachev, and there's perestroika and glasnost, so they're reforming. Nobody would have predicted that barely 5 years later, the Soviet Union had stopped to exist. And I think we are in a similar moment for the Olympic Games at the moment. And I think that maybe as Olympic Games expert, we underestimate perhaps a little of the crisis that has been brewing for a while. And I'm not saying that the Olympic Games won't exist in 5 years' time. Although if you look at Soviet specialists, that was precisely what they missed in 1980, that there was a possibility the Soviet Union would no longer exist in 5 years' time. But I think there's a turning point at which we are, partly because not just of the corona situation, but I think that's contributing to it. But I think increasingly we have seen a situation where the Olympic Games seem to be out of tune with many of the developments that are going on in our late modern society. And my question would be whether you think that the Olympic Games today, and I think there's comparison between Tokyo 1964 and Tokyo 2020, 2021 is actually quite a useful one, because you can see the Olympic Games in a way at the height of modern mass production, mass consumption capitalism in the 1960s, 1970s. And you can see them in the same city today at the height of the climate crisis and the sustainability transition. And I'm curious, I would like to hear your opinion, which has transformed more? Is it the city and the urban context and the social context in which those Olympic Games are happening? Or is it the Olympic Games that have transformed more over those what is it, a little more than 50 years, between 1964 and today. If you look kind of at the Japanese, the urban context on the one hand, and the Olympics context on the other, where do you see the most significant degree of changes? Well, and then I just wanted to say, perhaps for both talks, I learned really a lot. I think as a geographer, I was surprised to learn that the 1964 games, as you said, Isami, actually had many of the same rationales for which cities today host the Olympic Games. There was infrastructure, there was even gentrification, or at least upgrading of undesired neighborhoods, which, if you look at London, 2012 continues to today and beyond. I quite also like this idea of the myth of the Olympics that, it allowed Japan, in the minds of many Japanese, to become a modern, wealthy country. And maybe that's also something where we can draw parallel to Barcelona 1992, where there's also that myth that it allowed Barcelona to become the city that it is right now. And of course, if you look at Barcelona, one has now seen over the last couple of years also the flip side of the coin, as it were, if we look at issues such as over-tourism. So Barcelona has had very strong protests and very strong citizen mobilization because of over-tourism. And so the question of that success is always a success for whom, right? And that brings me back to where it started, which is people's participation and people's excitement to stand behind the Olympic Games, which, in my view, is probably the major change we have seen in the Olympic Games over the last 5 to 10 years. Even a country where in Japan, I think, you probably know better than me, but I think when Tokyo bid for the Olympic Games, there was actually quite a lot of support for those Olympic Games. And that's something that's turned. So I would be curious, in your opinion also, as you're also historians or know the history at least of the Olympic Games, where do you see ourselves now with this popular support of the Olympic Games? Where if you draw parallels to history? I'll stop there. I find it very exciting. Thanks everybody for putting together this panel. I really learned a lot.
Thank you both, Martin Lieder and Ana Maria Gaia, for these excellent questions you raised. And now we have time to hear Isami and Professor Lamartine reactions.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I think so. I changed I'm now I was stand up, but I now, okay. I will try to respond both questions from Professor Miragaya, Professor Müller. You asked me about this Ikeda dream team, or means Ikeda. What is Ikeda? For me, I was very surprised when I was starting to read in the Olympic, the narratives of Olympics during 1964, and how Ikeda was so cold position, or how Ikeda was not necessarily an enthusiastic actor during, in particularly from 1962 to 1964, that probably the Olympics needs to be, starting to build the future gymnasium and finally the Olympic Village. So my idea was Ikeda was not necessarily, or the apathy of Ikeda in the one side, but the other side, the district, in particularly Ohira and Miyazawa, finally they will become a prime minister after. They were so enthusiastic. Ohira was really nationalistic, and he was promoting the economic growth. So he really convinced Ikeda, you need to be in the part of this. So Ikeda said, I'm not interested, do it you. So I think the Ikeda was a really lazy guy in this. He's so shy guy. It's a very interesting type of politician, comparing to the opposite with his arch-rival Kishi, the grandfather of the Shinzo Abe. That is the opposite. He is the politician. He likes yes, we need to change everything. Ikeda is more Japanese style. He's not a really good guy speaking. So all the speech, Ohira and Miyazawa wrote all the speech. But probably the most important thing of Ikeda is he's be a really good guy to choose his dream team. It's the typical landlords. I'm not one to stereotype the Japanese like a samurais, all these things, but it's a type of samurai that he doesn't want to be the center of everything. He wants his apprentice, and the apprentice do everything, and finally but this is, I was very surprised, because my point of view, if you are really the host country of Olympics, you expect that the prime minister will be the like now the enthusiastic and said, yeah, I will do the Olympics, anything. So, and the other side, I think, is the case of Ikeda. Was he's really think that the Kishi create this thing. So he's not his child. He was not prepared to be prime minister in 1960. He never expected that the Kishi will be expelled in 1960. So probably his idea was Kishi will be 3 or more 4 years, or Kishi will be final in the Olympics, and this is my time, 1964 after Kishi. So probably everything was not expected. So but another point of view, analyzing his government itself, there's another guys, and I think there's many bureaucrats, professional bureaucrats in the government that plan the urbanization project and the economical project before 1959, even before they started in the 1952 when the Americans left Japan. So there's a project started in 1952 to create again, to rebirth Japan. And in this process, they were doing by themselves this project, including the urbanization project, the construction of the national stadium, how to deal with the American army in Tokyo, because the Washington Heights was a city, a big American city in Tokyo, in the middle of Tokyo. My research, I from one friend of mine, we walk this old Washington Heights, and both his architecture and architecture, and we never imagined that this was in the past American city. Never. So even for us, that it's supposed to be, we know the history of Japan, was a new really. So there's a process of one group, I don't want to say elite, but the bureaucrats, professional bureaucrats that design the city, design the high growth speed. And the other side is this Ikeda team. So this is the combination of these two things. And finally, Kishi idea that I want to be the center of the Olympics. This is the reason that Abe is so obsessed for the Olympics, because his grandpa couldn't be the center of the Olympics. So when he won the Olympics in 2009, he went with the grandpa's, meet with the grandpa, say, I will do the thing that you couldn't did it. Finally, we know the story that Abe couldn't be the prime minister. It's inevitable. So I think this is an interesting thing that this explains why Ikeda is so, in the strict sense, he's not an enthusiastic actor, but the other side, he's only his style. It's probably for us, it's difficult to imagine. No, because Latin America, I can imagine. No, any president will be in the center of the Olympics. I don't want to imagine any politician wants to be, but Ikeda was a different. Another aspect that the Professor Mueller, you asked about the 1964 to the continuum. My impression, I live in Tokyo during 9 years, and my impression is Tokyo has an own, logic as a urbanization city that is completely different from Olympics. My impression, for example, Shibuya, the city that is close to the Olympic Olympic facilities, is changing every year. Every 3 months, you have a new building. That's incredible. And this is not necessarily related to Olympics. It's completely the Japanese logic of capitalism and the creation of the new city and the city to like a future city. So my impression is if you go to Tokyo, not necessarily is related to but for example, after the earthquake of 2011, again, the Olympics became the new hope. Probably if we don't have the earthquake, that is impossible to imagine this, but remember 2009, Tokyo was elected as the city, so we don't have earthquake. So probably without earthquake will be a more futuristic Olympics, probably. But after 2011, this earthquake destroyed one part important of the city. And remember again, Remember, in 1945, we lost the war and the Olympics transformed us as a big country. Again, 2011, this earthquake destroyed our city. So it's, again, this nostalgia, this memorabilia. I don't know how to define this, but it's clearly. But I think the old generations probably have this image, but the new generation said, really, they don't know nothing about 1964. So it was a difficult, the Japanese government tried to create a movie, this nostalgia. The 1964 was incredible, but in the other side, they create the most anachronic image of Japan. For example, I will put out a simple example. 1964, if you are a kid, if you do bad things, one mister from your neighborhood punch you and punish you. This is the typical Japanese, we call Japanese ojisan, Japanese señor, mister, that has the right to punch any kid that is doing bad things. So this is a nostalgia. This is 1964. So Japanese government tried to put in 1964 was the wonder years, was the golden years. But after seeing this, the young generation, I don't want to be punched by any. And if one mister try to punch one kid now, no, forget it. It's impossible in Japan now because the times change. It's so there's a certain idealism or nostalgia about 1964. Try to create this, but the other side is completely. I think that, and this is the reason that they are refusing, in a many sense, the Olympics now. It's not Corona. It's not only Corona or the corruption of the actual government or the scandals. I think they think now we are not 1964. We can live without Olympics. We don't need to really. So who is really enthusiastic for the Olympics? All generation, the conservatives, and the ultra-right wing. So who is really, it's more like an ideological thing. And they are refusing completely to cancel the Olympics. And who is supporting to cancel the Olympics? The liberals, the opposition, the communists, an important sector that they don't really identify themselves with the Olympic movement. And I think this is the big mistake of now the Olympic organization in this time, that they couldn't convince the young generation to be involved. And they try using a Mario Bros, Nintendo, all these things that you saw in the Rio, when in the last part when Mr. Abe appears with dressed like that, but everything said is ridiculous. And I think everyone is saying the only thing, and I will finish this, the only thing that convinced many young people to be involved in the Olympics is the athletes, the young athletes, in particular one swimmer, that she was leukemia, and finally she returned. So this finally is the Japanese loves this drama of the sports. This is the other part that sometimes they like it to see. They like and they don't want to win the medals because it's, how to say, the Japanese love so much. And you can see in all this Japanese animation of sports, they effort, they run and say, and they like it. And I think it's the idea of the Japanese love so much, the Olympic as a party, as a festival. Okay, thank you very much. I think if you have any question, I will respond after. Okay.
Thanks, Professor Romero. And now, Professor Costa, if you want to make some comments.
I think Ana Miragaya hinted forward her questions to my presentation. Maybe she can make a summary, the main questions, please. And so I can have the comments for both presentations.
Yes, thank you very much. That's the third part. The second part was the questions for Professor Isami Romero. And now the third part, the questions to Professor Da Costa. The first question is related to your book, where in your presentation, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for your great contribution to the Olympic studies area, right? So much more to learn. We learn a lot and there is so much more ahead to learn, right? So I would like to start, referring to your book of 2002, Olympic Studies, current intellectual crossroads and taking the liberty to ask you the same question you used in your presentation to finish it, right? Facing these crossroads of doubts and indecisions, are we able to blame Rio or Tokyo otherwise for all the new Olympic pitfalls? Now, what are your thoughts on that?
Can you, the other questions are, please?
You
Can
want
you make
another
it?
question? Yeah, I formulated several questions.
I'm
A
thinking
second question for you would be from the event we are in now deals with Tokyo and the urban imaginary in the 1964 and in 2021 games, right? So I thought, how would you describe the relationship between Olympic studies area and the urban imaginaries?
And the third one,
One more.
one more.
During your presentation, you mentioned innovation in technology, and at the same time, the preservation and traditions, right? You also pointed out that the Rio 2016 Olympic Games were the edition of the games with the most connectivity. And you mentioned and you brought us the numbers, right? So what are your thoughts and expectations in relation to the 2021 Olympic Games? 2 months away, right? We are very close now. How will innovation, technology, and tradition articulate during the period of the games? And what do you think will be the meta narrative, since we're talking about meta narratives and narratives, what do you think will be the meta narrative of the Olympic Games and of the host city? Maybe now you have to do some magic to concentrate the 3 questions into one.
I try to make some magic, making an assemblage of your questions and the comments from Martin Miller. Let me see, just concentrate in a few positions just to make sure there will be more room to other questions. The first question of Ana Miragaya is not from Martin Miller. For me, is the core of the discussion about the Olympics and the discussion about imaginary city imaginaries or urban imaginary. Doesn't matter. There are so many interpretations of this same subject that there are a confusion and sometimes a confusion about how to select the right interpretation in order to have some directions, some meanings. Anyway, I would like to emphasize that we're facing constraint, historical constraint in the Olympic Games. And happenings before, symptomatically, Pierre de Coubertin pointed out all of this question we are making today. We must pay attention to this point because they are not only historical, we are walking in circles around the same situation, very interesting situation. And I try to point it out that constraints, we have it in 2002 during the book, because the Olympic scholars, several of them, 50 answers survey, and they pointed out the same constraints. And today we still are identifying the same constraints. I just put it in the screen. I think we are facing a hubris. It's an excess that we cannot control. We have this, the first time that Coubertin make an assumption about this was in the 30s. And we did not control, and I think we have it in Tokyo. We have it before. We are still with this, all these constraints. Gigantism is there. There was in the past and is still there. You mentioned Agenda 2020. I mean, Ana Miragaia, you're right. It's an attempt to control the exaggeration, but we're not sure there will be good results about this. I think Tokyo is a new kind of Olympics and a test to understand what we're doing with the Olympic Games. Because up to now is constraint, and constraint. The gigantism brings us excess of commercialization, uncontrolled. Maybe it is uncontrolled. In Tokyo, we have $14 billion involved. 14. All the expenses in Rio was 16. To have an idea of this exaggeration, Sochi went up to $100 billion. We are dealing with hubris, exaggeration, and I'm not sure that Tokyo is going to change it. We can speak about the new Olympics. I'm not sure. We have to test it. Maybe they have to find some solution about the $14 billion of expenses. I don't know about this. It's very symptomatic too that the Olympic federations, the sports federations, sport federation, look to the Agenda 2020 with some distance. They are not really involved in this. So the IOC is making the best to change it. That's why I use philosophical interpretations, apparatic. We understand the Olympics as a good tradition, a very long tradition, one of the oldest tradition of humanity, more 2,500 years. It's too much. In the old Western world, Greece, the Europeans, and now all the world is still there. And with the same problems. That's why I use apparatic. It's good and bad. You just make your choice because both has the same value. That's why to Ana Miragaia, that's why I emphasized in the last question, the closing remarks, this possibility. The other comment I can make now related to Martin Miller and Ana Miragaia is the urban imaginary connected to Olympic Games. He said he is a geographer. Okay. Also in geography, we have many works about the urban imaginary, like many other disciplines, area of knowledge. Doesn't matter. It's okay to respect this in the situation we are discussing. This is the central subject of this webinar. Okay, what's going to happen there in Tokyo? There are some words, some papers from Japan that are saying that technology is living together with the tradition. I hope it's going to be a reality of the games. I'm not sure. For using the example of Rio, in Rio, connectivity was the name of the game. What's not Olympic game or meta-narrative or narrative? No, connectivity, like many other phenomenal events in the country and over the world. And please remember that Tokyo will be a global event, again, with technology and connectivity. And for sure, there, we're going to see another big invasion of connectivity. So it's a test to Japan and for the world to understand if technology, and I mean connectivity in this case, can live together with the tradition. We have to see it as a test. We cannot say it now. In Rio, in my opinion, connectivity was the name of the game. And if the connective will be the ruler of the next Olympic Games, now you have the trend, and it will be proven that the excess, the hubris of the Olympic Games is still alive. Now, we must change our opinion about urban imaginary. It is there, it's surviving, but we're not sure that can face technology in a sense that we can have as a rationality. So to Martin Miller, I think, yes, we can find the urban imaginary in different connections because it's a question of frame. This is not my idea. We have seen it in literature. It's a question of framing. We can frame the imaginary in different situations. And this situation, it's the proof that can survive facing technology. And we're going to see it in the few ahead. The third point from Ana Miragaya also in some possibility, in some ways commented by Martin Miller, is technology in Tokyo 2021. As I said before, this is a test. There will be a predominance. Romero said the same. And he's connected to young people in Tokyo and in Japan. All right, young people is there. They are responsible for more than the connectivity phenomenon that we have seen in Rio. And you're going to see it in Tokyo and all over the world. It's all right. We can protect this subject in order to have a real approach to the games. But we don't have any way now to see the right position, the proportion, one thing to another. I think it's all I can say at this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Costa and Romero, thank you both for your responses. And as a moderator, I have to notice that we have around 15 minutes. We schedule a meeting of 2 hours meeting. So I think we will have to gather in one round of comments and questions from the audience. So Professor Jean-Luc is the first one.
Right. Okay.
Please, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentations and the comments also. I enjoyed them a lot. I learned a lot, and I will give 2 comments and questions if you want. One to the first presentation, to Professor Romero's presentation. I confirmed to me that we are more and more with the Olympics, not in a urban affair, as it was the case in 1964, but more in a geopolitical affair, as it is now the case with Tokyo 2021. And you say that you say the Prime Minister of Japan in 1964, Mr. Ikeda, felt it was not his business. It was the Tokyo's governor's business to organize the Olympics. But of course, we know that 2020 and 2021 is very much the Prime Minister business, Mr. Abe first, and now Mr. Suga. And this is why the Olympics were not canceled and will not be canceled probably, because this is a geopolitical affair. It has nothing to do with the pandemics. It has to do with Korea and China and the foreign policy of Japan. It is not a urban affair as it was in 1964. I think it is more a geopolitical affair, and more. And also because this new policy of not constructing facilities anymore. Of course, Tokyo is a turning point. Tokyo built a lot of facilities for the 2021 Olympics, but after Tokyo is Paris 2024 and LA 2028 and maybe Brisbane 2032, and they are not going to build many facilities. They are going to use existing facilities. So less urban renewal as it was in 1964 in Tokyo and in many other cities like Rio and others. So what do you think about this comment on shifting from urban to geopolitical? And my second comment, well, you can answer if you want, right? But
okay, no.
The second one, then
As
you like.
I can respond after.
Izami, just
someone can
please,
make a question.
We'll have to have a round of questions. So please, Luis, Professor Luis.
I was writing here in the chat, but okay. So good morning to all. Really interesting presentation from all. I took some notes. I want to ask you, Professor Romero, about Ganefo Games. Do you think they had an impact on the choice of Tokyo in '64? I mean, the local and regional questions during Asia Cold War in the '60s, how that played a role in the election to Tokyo. Also, I find really interesting the lobby that you mentioned in Latin America. I was remembered that I'm studying. I did a dissertation, a PhD dissertation in Avalanche election to FIFA, and then I remember that Avalanche traveled to Japan in '64, I think, in '63 and '64, and I have some photos of that trip. So probably that was part of the lobby. But at that time, Tokyo was already elected to be the host city in '64, but. Still, I have some photos of that visit I can send to you if you are interested. And also, even I think I was thinking about that, and even the admiration towards Japan in the '60s for Latin Americanists. You know that you have that expression, Japan miracle, and Brazil in the '70s, they experienced a similar growing. And they name it the same way. And if you read the newspapers at the time and the press at the time, you will find a lot of reference about Japan and the Brazilian national press. They are also referring to Brazil as the new Japan. What happens to Japan in the '50s and '60s is now what's happening in Brazil in the '60s and the '70s. So I think that we here in Latin America have to understand a little bit more of this relationship and how Japan influenced Brazil and the other countries in the '60s. So I was really interested in our research. So maybe we can talk a little bit about after somewhere else. So thank you.
Thanks, Luis. Any other question from the audience? So I would like to gather one more question for both exciting presentations. But I was interested to hear you a little bit more about your sources. For example, Professor Izami, it's based on let's say his political history approach, and I'd like to hear from you about, for example, newspapers, magazines, or how could we study the Olympics, the 1914 experience of the Olympics in Tokyo, based on not only, let's say, in commas, the official sources, just to have an idea of from the public opinion. For example, the film made by the IOC, of course, is an official source, but it's an important narrative about the showing the public, showing the tourists. So I'd like to hear you both a little bit more concerning, in general, the Olympic studies, how to deal with the sources we mobilize to deeper understand the meaning of the Olympic Games to the citizens, based on the principle that we are here focused on the urban imaginary. Thank you both.
So we respond, or we will?
Yes.
Or okay. I will try to respond to your question, Bernardo. In the sources, in the beginning, I started with the not official one. I started the government archives in Japan. Before 2001 was impossible, not impossible, but was really, really difficult to read the Japanese government official, not official, the archives. But in 2001, they created a new law that they introduced the 13 years rule, like America, like a national archives. So now you can see any archives of the 1960s now. So this is the best, the first, in my cases, we are able to see what happened in 1960s. And this is the explanation about Ikeda was not enthusiastic, but for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was so enthusiastic to do many, promote the Olympics. The other one I tried to use, but I couldn't use in an article, is I would say the writers. Two writers in particular, Yukio Mishima, and Kenzaburo Oe. These two guys was the witness of the Olympics, and Mishima was so criticizing really the Olympics because they consider it a completely Western. And we know finally Mishima was a ultra-nationalist point of view, but Mishima still an important narrator, an important actor that about the Olympics. So there's many texts about that Mishima wrote in Japan. It's an interesting thing. I can translate in the future, but Mishima wrote a lot of things about the Olympics. So this is, and the newspapers and NHK, in the broadcast system of Japan, established in the finally in Shibuya, in the area that finally was the Olympic stadium. So NHK starting to create a new, how to say, literature. They are just interesting, the history of itself, the NHK. So in the case of the sources, I think the most important, and obviously the diary of the members of the committee, particularly Takeda. Takeda was his son was the actual Olympic organizer, but he was expelled because from the corruption. So the Takeda family, is the imperial family. He's part of the imperial family. So the Takeda clan can be really, really interesting. If you want to study about the Japanese Olympics from 1964 to 2020, this family was involved in everything, Takeda. This is one. In the case of the Ganefo was a really, really problematic for Japan because Indonesia, Indonesia was an important country for Japan. And from Ikeda was involved in the confrontasi, the conflict between Indonesia and Malaysia. And he tried to be the middle of he tried to convince Indonesia to stop particularly his personal relation with Sukarno. So because Sukarno, the third wife of Sukarno is Japanese, Debbie. So he wants to use this connection with Sukarno, and JFK asked to Ikeda to be, please try to stop Sukarno. But finally, when the Sukarno and the Ganefo was really so this is the only thing that I found that the Ikeda want to try to involve in the Olympics was in the case of the Ganefo, try to convince particularly Indonesia to be returned to the Olympics finally. So this clearly personal point of the Ikeda. The only probably thing that Ikeda was interested in the Olympics. and the presence of Korea, the both Koreas. Remember that finally North Korea decided to not to come to Tokyo, but the main idea of the Ikeda was to invite both North and South and start into the process of the normalization of the relations. So Ikeda was another topic that is not really, this is an important article written in Japanese. So Ganefo is a really important thing. About Havelange, I think that Havelange was in Japan, and probably I'm interested in the presence of Havelange. And the other question about the geopolitical, I think the case of Abe and Suga, clearly they want to be, it's a clear message to China that we are different. But remember, Peking is coming now. So probably for the Japan is a really headache now. They need to do the best Olympic, because Peking, the Winter Olympic will be incredible. I think the Peking Olympic will be better than Tokyo, and not only in terms of the sports is different, but I think this. So, and there's another factor that sometimes this Olympics is clearly different from 1964. In 1964, the mayor of the Tokyo, Azuma, was close related to Kishi, because Kishi supported him. So it's a really good connection with Azuma, Kishi, and finally with Ikeda. So this finally both the Tokyo and the Japanese government was in the same logic. But now Miss Koike, the actual governor of she has a whole own personal ambition to be the first female prime minister in Japan. So she is blocking Abe and Suga, or she's playing in the both sides. In the one side, she's playing with Bach and try to use the IOC as a key element for her prestige. In the other side, convinced to Abe and now Suga to be. So probably now is incredible, but we have another actor that we never expected, the mayor of, because the mayor that was involved in 2009 is another person. It's another person. So probably all the actors in 2009 that they expected to be in the entrance ceremony, probably will nobody's involved. Even Takeda, Abe, and Inose, these three guys that was involved, everybody's out. So, but this interesting question of how, I think it's a geopolitical, clearly in the case of Abe, is clearly a geopolitical and clear message to China that the Japan is important. I don't know, but my personal point of view is China is different. Now Japan is not have a now possibility to not only to compete with China, but again, it's a nostalgia, and clearly Japan needs to be this national pride about we are different from China. Okay.
Thanks, Romero. Professor Costa, please. You are muted. We can hear you, Professor Costa.
Hello? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Our Olympic group of research has 3 decades, and our specialization is collective works. We have books in English, and 2 English and Chinese, and now 2 with English, Portuguese, and Spanish. I think is the unique in the world now, because we trust in globalization, at least in knowledge, understanding, to provide knowledge, to construct knowledge, to elaborate knowledge. Another thing is in 2002, when we start this production of books, international books, we have the reaction of many scholars from Olympic Games, and most of them criticize the games. So we find a very interesting solution is put together not in favor, but different understanding, different approach to Olympic Games. Up to date, we are doing just the same. Last year, we have 2 books in English and Portuguese, and one on technology with Japanese participation, and another one with several Olympic scholars from different countries. In fact, 32 participants. Very interesting in this. About Coubertin and what happens in 1918 with the pandemic. At that time, there were some designations of Spanish fever. In fact, it was an American fever. Anyway, this book have different approach to the same situation. And we think we need this in the case of the Olympic Games, as many others approach to different problems of today's globalization's affairs, happenings, and occurrence. We need this. So when you ask for sources, we have a solution for this. In this case of this seminar, is to produce a list of these books, and most of them you can take by download with links. We can provide this because otherwise, I think we're going to discuss. But this is electronic, is a connectivity, and in a few minutes after 11 hours here in Rio AM, there will be nothing. We just forget it. And we have to make it a composition of electronic means and to provide the sources for the students and for the scholars. If the organization think it's a good idea, I'm ready. And I think Ana Miragaia also can do the same. We are very accustomed to do this all the time. Just provide your presentation, then you send your sources and papers and information. Otherwise, you're not dealing with an academic affair. We're dealing just a discussion. But I'm at your disposal to this new approach to this meeting. We have a discussion here in order to have in a book, but I don't know if you, because there are many questions in the air. Anyway, there will be, this possibility. In fact, I'm a curator of an electronic museum, a very advanced one in Portuguese, English, and Spanish now. And to support this museum, we have the exposition, but we have the books to follow the exposition. We have a good exposition about Pierre de Coubertin and the reinvention of the Olympic Games in 1918. Very interesting, as I mentioned before. And probably after Tokyo, we are discussing about the possibility to have another book after the games, and maybe this group, Jean-Luc loves those kind of proposals, I know, and many other colleagues here, maybe we can do it, and we can produce the book because we have a good organization to do this, and we can have it in English, Portuguese, and in Japanese, maybe, because we have now a good connection with the Japanese, just because of the technology, and we need specialists to discuss the Olympic subject with an approach on technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Costa. We are on time, but Patrick wrote a question by using the chat, and I don't know if Professor Izami saw it, read it, and if you still want to.
I responded him
Okay.
by the way. I responded directly, so it's privately. So
Okay.
I will. So, but if we need to be public, no, I think it's not. I am agree with the idea that the different audience for this Olympics 1964, 2020 is the different audience in Japan. But earthquake was a really important aspect that changed completely the logic of the Olympics in 2020. Before earthquake was Japan is the future country, the technology. And after the earthquake is the more like we need to recover, we need to show them in the world that we are different. And do you remember, and everybody that criticized Abe with this, but somebody asked about the nuclear plant disaster, and he said it's under control. So now everybody's using this to criticize Abe. Nothing is under control, but he lied. He lied impartially. He lied like as a politician. He said it's under control, but clearly this nuclear problem is not under control. And this now new scandal that is now Japan decided to throw the water, the radioactive water into the sea. So again, the earthquake is a different, and probably it's interesting how the national disasters affect the Olympics. No, before the organization, how to one, and I don't know, but every cases has a trauma. No, like Barcelona has the trauma of the Franco. I don't know. The Spain itself has a trauma. So probably I want to finish with this. Like many Olympics try to say to cure this trauma. No, that this stigma that we used to have. Many countries has a dark past, and sometimes Olympics is the best choice to to cure this type of trauma or change our own trauma. And probably Japan is a clear example. Both wars, no war, earthquake. I think so.
Thank you very much, Professor Izami. I would like to give thanks for all of you from the audience that followed us up to this end. Special thanks also to Elena that always support us. Tomorrow we will have a new link for the fourth and final panel on June 4 that will happen on June 14. So I would like to give thanks for our panelists and for our audience, inviting you to subscription for the fourth panel. And tomorrow, between global economic trends and sports integrity, we will have as panelists Professor Emmanuel Bale and Pim Verschuren, both of them from the University of Lausanne, and two Brazilian colleagues that are going to be the panelists as the commentators. Daniel Malansky, PhD at Nouvelle-Sorbonne University, and the sociologist Michel Nicolau from the University of Campinas in Sao Paulo. So thank you very much. See you in June.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.